probably a slightly more refined version of what Reform was saying back in May, the idea of vote Green, get illegal. So there's almost certainly quite a strong political message being sent here, but not just to people like the Lib Dems, but also to some Labour backbenchers who perhaps haven't got this issue too much in their own constituencies, that when Shabana Mahmood brings forward tougher proposals, bear in mind that it won't just be your colleagues representing places like Stoke and Trent that will feel the impact of them failing. It'll be your constituents as well.
Welcome to The Times at 1 on Times Radio with me, Jo Coburn. Sharing the load of housing asylum seekers more evenly across the country sounds fair. The Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, says it is indefensible for the most deprived communities to take a disproportionate share simply because rents there are cheaper. The Prime Minister has said wealthier parts of the country will be expected to do their bit. Almost 98,000 people are currently in government-funded accommodation. The politics is straightforward enough. This is the ground Reform UK has made its own, and Labour is trying to occupy it. The question is what that costs elsewhere in the seats Labour needs to win or hold. Communities near the proposed military sites point out that in some cases, the number of new arrivals would significantly outnumber the villagers nearby. Local MPs from more than one party are objecting. Police leaders are warning about capacity. Ministers say the change is temporary. The commitment, they insist, is still to cut the use of expensive hotels, remove more people whose claims fail, and tighten the system overall. Similar promises have been made before, and the hotels are still there. It hands the Conservatives a simple line: more money being spent housing asylum seekers in more expensive parts of Britain, with little consultation with the people who live there. Apart from a policy shift on where asylum seekers should live, the Home Office has published a booklet explaining what is expected of people claiming asylum while they're in the UK. For example, men and women have equal rights, choose who they marry or not, and make their own decisions. It also sets out that you should never physically or verbally abuse your partner. Political opponents have jumped on the leaflet as a tacit admission that the wrong people are being allowed into the country. This is what former Safeguarding Minister Jess Phillips had to say.
Actually, it's as important. I used to run a project for sexual violence victims from Poland, for example, in the West Midlands. What we realised was that actually the language and the expectation of victims of those crimes was completely different. For example, they didn't have the same expectation of free services for victims. Mm-hmm. Like people's different countries in the world have different systems. It's very important that you tell people settling. And actually, there's been a huge feminist movement to try and inform women entering, whether illegally or not illegally. In fact, the vast majority completely legally to our country are given leaflets and materials to tell them about what rights they can expect in our country.
Jess Phillips there. Well, success on a key plank of immigration will be a powerful narrative for Andy Burnham's government. But there is still the risk of highly visible protests and increased pressure on local services in response to decisions made about where asylum seekers are housed in the near future. This is The Times at 1 on Times Radio with me, Jo Coburn. Let's speak to Kevin Foster, former Conservative Immigration Minister. Welcome to The Times at 1. Are you in agreement that richer areas need to take their share?
Well, Jo, at the end of the day, when you've got large numbers of people coming into the country, it's inevitable that all parts of the country will see the impact of that. And I suspect this is a none too subtle message from the government that many of these areas are places that have Liberal Democrat or even Green MPs in one or two cases, where they've traditionally voted for a party that opposes cracking down on illegal migration, yet the problems have gone elsewhere, particularly to the bigger cities where Labour's been struggling politically over the last year in local elections. It's probably a slightly more refined version of what Reform was saying back in May, the idea of vote Green, get illegal. So there's almost certainly quite a strong political message being sent here, but not just to people like the Lib Dems, but also to some Labour backbenchers who perhaps haven't got this issue too much in their own constituencies, that when Shabana Mahmood brings forward tougher proposals, bear in mind that it won't just be your colleagues representing places like Stoke and Trent that will feel the impact of them failing. It'll be your constituents as well.
Right, and that is the political messages you have set out. But broadly speaking, will it come across as just fairer? It isn't fair that certain parts of the country take more asylum seekers or house more asylum seekers in their patch just because it's cheaper.
Yeah, Joe, I think there is a fairness argument there. I can remember being the person who used to point out that whilst the SNP argued for being more welcoming to asylum seekers at that time, 31 out of 32 areas refused to be part of asylum accommodation in Scotland. And the only exception was Glasgow, the biggest city in Scotland, in places like Edinburgh were refusing. So I can see the Facebook, but there are some realities here of how the UK's housing market works as well. That there's not really many houses in multiple occupation in small villages. And of course, as you've just touched on, the costs will be higher. So the government's going to need to be clear how much extra they'll be paying when actually their idea of getting people out of hotels was to reduce the bills overall.
It will rely, won't it, on a broad pledge from the government that they're just going to try and reduce the numbers overall. They are going to keep moving towards trying to cut and close those expensive hotels. So there is a sort of transition. Do you think people will buy that?
I suspect they won't, because actually hotel costs aren't that different to the cost per night per person of some of the larger sites, like the ones you've just referenced near Piddington in Oxfordshire or Linton-on-Ouse in North Yorkshire. The costs aren't that dramatically different. And of course, there is actually some argument that where you've got people in something like a hotel, there's at least some monitoring going on, whereas if they're dispersed into housing across a local community, well, that clearly isn't going on in the way it can via security at a hotel. So I'm not sure people, no asylum accommodation is popular. No community is ever going to thank an immigration minister for placing accommodation in their area. And what it ultimately brings back to is really for the government, that is to look at how they can stop the flow coming into the UK. And that is almost certainly going to mean going a lot further than perhaps many Labour MPs would feel comfortable with on things like the ECHR and in particular removals out of the UK.
Well, as you say, successive governments have tried with various slogans and policies to stop the boats, and it hasn't yet happened, even if numbers are coming down slightly. What do you make of this pamphlet that the Home Office has published, this guidance for asylum seekers, warning them not to rape or sexually harass people, including partners and children?
Well, it's an extraordinary admission of the type of person that's coming in via small boats. And the idea that we're having to give someone a leaflet to tell them that you shouldn't be sexually assaulting children is absolutely mind-blowing. And the idea it's going to work is, I think, just complete for the birds. If someone's that determined, giving them a leaflet isn't going to stop them. And I think I'd take slight issue with what Jess Phillips said. This isn't about advising victims, potential victims. This isn't being given for women or to children about their rights. This is actually being given to potential offenders. So it's extraordinary. And I'm amazed when you read through it. It, for example, references the age of consent is 16, but doesn't make clear 16 and 17-year-olds are actually still legally children. They're not adults. So I don't see this having much of an impact, but it speaks volumes and also really politically brings the urgency for Andy Byrne about why he needs to find a solution for this problem, even if some of the solutions will not be things many Labour MPs are very keen to vote for.
Kevin Foster, former Conservative Immigration Minister, thank you for talking to us today.